Fire Emblem Engage personal skill tier list version 2. All right, so this is after 500 hours of Maddening in the base game without DLC or the well. So obviously using DLC or running the well might influence these to some degree, because a lot of how these interact with units and with classes directly relates to how strong those units or classes are. And with certain things, like for example Star Sphere, you can drastically increase the viability of any unit. So I'm factoring in unit viability and how good the passive is in actual gameplay. So when you're actually playing the game, how can you take advantage of a specific passive to influence the outcome of combat or to affect gameplay? All right, so for the first one, let's go with Divinely Inspiring. So this is Alir's. This gives you +3 damage to adjacent allies and -1 damage taken. Now this ignores armor, so I would say it's really good. It allows you to take a 0 damage unit and allow them to at least hit for 3, 6, or 12 damage, depending on if they're using, if they can hit once, hit twice from doubling, or hit 4 times from Brave. It also stacks with abilities that are multi-hit and engage abilities, and arguably it's one of the best abilities in the game, because all you have to do is be next to Alir and you just get extra damage. I mostly use it for the extra damage. The damage mitigation is nice. It's kind of relevant if you just park a tank next to Alir to reduce damage a little bit more, but you mostly use it for the damage. All right, next we have Alabaster Duty. This is Vander's. So if unit is adjacent to the Divine Dragon, grants crit +5 during combat to both of them. Now Vander is arguably one of the worst units in the game. Some people use him for the early game. I personally don't need him for the early game. I just feed all my XP to Alir. I would say this is either bad or okay. I'll say it's okay. Let's say you're running DLC. It could be okay if you're running Vander, I guess. If you use like Star Sphere and use Divine Paralogs to level him up. But in normal play, I'd say it's kind of bad. But its effect, crit +5, isn't horrible. It's just that Vander himself isn't that good of a unit. So arguably it's in D tier. But for fun, we'll put it in C. All right. Verdant Faith. I almost said Verdant. So this is clans. If unit is adjacent to Divine Dragon, grants a hit +10 to both of them. So clan, arguably on base game, is not one of the best units to invest in early game. Some people like to use him, but he's definitely not as strong as other things. And he does require some investment to level him up. I'm going to say this is good. Maybe just okay. I'm going to be honest about this one and this one. I'm moving this down because it's on Vander, right? So even if it's crit +5, you have to run a crit build. It's not really that useful. The hit +10 can be useful, but Alir is very accurate, so it's not really helping Alir out that much. And you also have to position Alir next to either a frail unit or a second sealed clan, which in most cases is just a bad Panette or a bad Warrior Fagato. So it's just not really worth it to run clan. So I'm gonna put this in C. Crimson Cheer on Fram. So I'm going in order, even though these are not particularly in order. Unfortunately, I'm just gonna go in order based on availability and when you get units. All right. If unit is adjacent to Divine Dragon, grants avoid +10 to both of them. This one I actually think is good. The reason for this is Fram is a Chi Adept, right? And she can Chain Guard early on. And if you want to use her long term, you can. And the avoid +10 is kind of nice. If you want to keep her on Chi Adept, she basically could be a Lucina holder. And as long as she's always next to Alir, you're looking at an extra 10 avoid for both of them, including her. So you combine that with dual support from Lucina, which scales avoid based on support level. And you have some big potential avoid stacking here to make her hard to hit so that everyone else is invincible around her. So this, in a practical situation, is at least B tier, potentially A tier if you just run her as your Chi Adept. And honestly, I think that actually makes a lot of sense. Avoid +10 is pretty good, for sure. So it's at least B, maybe A tier. I would need to test it on a Maddening run to see how consistent I can get her avoid stacking early. But even just for the simple fact that Alir is pretty dodgy due to speed early game, you generally hit 30 to, I don't know, 60% incoming hit rates on average. Like enemies usually have around like a 30 to 60, maybe 70% chance to hit you. That does matter. And if you throw in like an avoid engraving on Alir, this could stack up. So in a practical sense, this is going to be happening a lot, right? It actually makes sense. Like you're going to be setting up chain guards, so you're going to be getting this avoid. And this also helps because if the enemies miss you, then you don't consume the chain guard. So if you're chain guarding two things and they miss Alir, then the other ally or Alir themselves can get hit a second time and then also get chain guarded. So pretty good ability. All right, self-improver Alfred. If unit uses weight without attack or using items, grants strength +2 for 1 turn. So this one, I'll say is like okay. It's definitely not bad. If you're going to run Alfred, you can at least make use of this on enemy phase where you can't attack enemies and you're just setting up like a counter attack. And his personal class, Avenir, allows him to randomly reduce damage. So within the context of his own kit, if you invest in him, it kind of makes sense. So I'll just say it's okay. Moved to tiers, Boucheron. Gotta find it. There it is. All right. When an ally joins a chain attack in this unit's combat, unit deals +2 damage. So if you want to run Boucheron and you invest in him and you want to run like a Brave Axe build or a quad build or even something like Halberdier Brave Lance or something like that, you could make use of this. And at the very least, as long as you have chain attacks, he's constantly dealing +2 damage. This is actually a decent ability. It's not great because it's on Boucheron, but it's viable and it's relevant and it's not that hard to set up mid-game and on. Early game, it's difficult to set up because he's kind of the only support or the only backup for a while until you get Anna. And a lot of people don't like to use Anna as a backup. They tend to just power level her into something else or second seal her into mage. Either is fine, but he tends to be the only backup for, a few chapters. Diamant also is a backup that you get, and Lapis. So there's some backups. There's some potential, but until then, it does nothing, unfortunately, until you get other backups. But it is a good ability, and there is a use case for it, and getting +2 damage is pretty decent. All right, Energized Etier. So I'm looking for the battery. Here we go. It almost looks like a battery. I would say... So, all right, so when unit recovers HP using an item, grants strength +2 for 1 turn. So this is a weird one. It's kind of like self-improver, but maybe like better. It's very much like self-improver. I'll just say it's okay. Now, Etier is not the best enemy phase tank early on because she's very frail, but if you invest in her and second seal her into a more durable class, she could make use of this. The idea would be that she's an enemy phase tank build of some sort, and she's damage boosts off of using like vulnaries and elixirs and anti-poisons. And even then, though, like +2 strength for using an item, there's like an economic cost to it that makes it kind of not so good, but it's still +2 strength. And if you want to make some weird enemy phase build, it at least does something that's useful. So that's like okay tier by definition. Bad is like it does nothing. Like it's still +2 damage. It's just kind of weird to get it out. Saline Gentle Flower. I would say this is actually great. Now, it's not great for the entire game, or maybe it is. All right, so recovery items used by allies within 2 spaces heal +50% HP. So this allows allies to spike heal themselves with vulnaries and elixirs. Elixirs heal 45 HP with this in effect, and vulnaries heal 22. And I think anti-poisons are the same as vulnaries for healing, right? It's both like 15, so it'd still be 22, but also, hold on, recovery. I think this also affects leftovers. So leftovers should heal for 30 then instead of 20, right? So it affects recovery items, so it is useful. And this is great early game for when your healers are tied up, when you don't have that many staff units, for if you're running low on heals. It's just good to have because it's passive, so it's just like, your backline just always has access to spike healing. And then late game it's good because you can turn elixirs into a full heal, which is how they usually work, but they're more available and cheaper in this game. But it is a really good utility. And honestly, it's kind of what passives... I think the passives that work off of positioning are the most entertaining to use. Like, they're the most fun to use. And the ones that are just kind of like doing some like specific thing aren't as enjoyable. But just like the positioning ones, I enjoy the most. But also they're very useful, right? Like being able to have things spike heal themselves is objectively useful. and especially for early to mid game, it's nice. So that way your staff units who, maybe need the magic to kill an armor or something, they're freed up. So you have flexibility, and that's why it's good. All right, Louis, Admiration. If 2 female allies are adjacent within 2 spaces, this unit takes 2 less damage during combat. So this, it improves his resistance to magic. It's a straight damage reduction to all damage sources, including, I believe, worms, even though they penetrate armor, because it's 2 less damage. So if the math checks out, mechanically it should reduce the damage. I haven't tested it, but it should. It definitely reduces magic damage. I would say this is like up there. If you're gonna invest in Louis, this is a good ability. It's free damage. What is Self-Improver? Hold up. They use their, hold on, this is the wrong thing. I'm looking at a thing, and this is Chloe's. Self-Improver, I think it's this. Hold on, I have an inaccurate thing. 1 second. Yeah, that's Chloe's. Self-Improver is not that. That's Fairy Tale Folk. Self-Improver is the red one. All right, hold on, my bad. All right, there you go. Yeah, you're like, why is Chloe's ability in C tier? I was misinformed. They had the wrong thing. All right, I'm on the wiki now. I have the wiki as the reference now. That's better. Hopefully no ads play with audio. That's the reason I don't like to use the wiki on my second screen. Okay, so we have Admiration. All right, Fairy Tale Folk. Chloe. If male and female ally are adjacent within 2 spaces, unit deals +2 damage during combat. I would say this is here. I would put it in OP if it were easier to set up. But essentially, you always need to have a male and a female next to her to get it to activate consistently. So if you can get it to activate consistently, it's S tier. It's +2 armor ignoring damage, right? Or maybe it's not. +2. I know, +2 damage. Yeah, it should be armor ignoring damage, similar to Alir's. So S tier if you can get it set up consistently. Otherwise, it's A tier. So it's kind of like in between, depending on how, what you want like a male flyer and then like a female flyer. So you could run Kagetsu. You could run Pandreo on Griffin Knight with like 11 sword. You could run male Alir. And then you could run like Marin. You could run Lapis Wyvern. So like Marin Wyvern, Lapis Wyvern. Who else? Female Alir Wyvern. So those are like the main options, at least as far as I'm concerned, for triggering this. And she's a good unit throughout all of the early to mid game. And then late game, she just needs a strength emblem ring and she's fine. But this is a really good passive. All right, Expertise, Jean. Grants unit enhanced growth, stat growth when leveling up. So when you play into this, it's overpowered, for sure. When you invest in him and you play into this, it can make him one of the best combat units in the game. However, it does require a lot of investment, and you will have to change your game plan, and you're not just going to be able to plug him into your team and then he just flies off the handle and goes nuts. I have personally used Jean as a Chi Adept for an entire Maddening run, and he was actually behind the pack, just being like a staff bot. So at some point, you have to consciously switch him over into like some kind of damage class to take advantage of this. And keeping him on Chi Adept feels kind of weak overall, unless somehow he's getting kills, but his base stats aren't high enough for him to deal damage consistently on Chi Adept. So you have to switch him off Chi Adept, is what my point is, to something that can take advantage of this passive. However, when you do take advantage of it, he can snowball and it can make him crazy. So arguably, it has the potential to be overpowered, but it depends on how you use it. So it could actually move up or down depending on how you take advantage of it. All right, Fair Fight, Diamant. If unit initiates combat, grants hit +15 to unit and foe. If foe is able to counterattack, I would say this is like the lower end of great. It's definitely strong, right? Like getting hit +15 is good. Diamant has kind of low dex cap, especially on his main class, so he kind of needs this. And without it, he has kind of poor hit rates. So when he hits things that can't counterattack, it does reduce his hit rate. But overall, it's just like free accuracy, and if we're rating it as a passive being used in the game, it helps. Aspiring Hero, Amber. If no other units are within 1 space of unit or foe, grants hit +20 at the cost of avoid -10. So in order for this to trigger, nothing can be around you or the enemy in terms of allies or enemies. So it says of no other units. I think it also includes clones. So if you have clones, near either of you, I believe that counts it as a unit. So it does give him hit plus 20, and it's not the hardest thing to set up. Now, Amber's best class, it's debatable. It might be Halberdier. I'm not so sure. It might be Warrior. But he, on Halberdier, will never trigger his own passive, but on other classes he will. I would say this is like lower end of good, because Amber, I don't think is that good of a unit. He's not bad. He's like a B tier, maybe a high C tier. Mostly because he needs investment, and there's better things to run early game. But it's not a bad ability. It can be situational. It can be easy for it to fail. All right, Jade, Meditation. If unit uses weight without attacking or using items, grants res plus 2 for 1 turn. So Jade's whole thing is that she's Louis, but better with res. That's like her whole gimmick. And Meditation kind of plays into that by reducing magic damage by 2 more when she waits. And generally, tanks will be waiting. It's like kind of like waiting with Dedue, you know, except it's not as impactful. I would say this is like okay. Like mid okay. Because you have to completely waste a turn for this to trigger, and plus 2 res it's not exciting me, you know, it's not going to drastically improve Jade. Overall, Jade is kind of like a mid-tier unit that doesn't really do that much. She's okay, but there's better things for tanking. So I would say it's kind of okay. Get Behind Me, Alchrist. When an ally within 2 spaces is attacked, grants strength plus 3 for 1 turn. So this is actually pretty good. I would say this is like here. This is good because it's plus 3 damage or more if you're doubling or quadding, and it's really easy for this to trigger. And if you're enemy phasing, meaning you're getting hit on enemy phase and counterattacking and putting damage on enemies, you can easily trigger this consistently, and Alchrist just has plus 3 strength. So yeah, pretty easy to trigger, pretty good passive, and then during your turn you get to actually attack with it. So, and also the range within 2 spaces, so he can be, you know, a little far away to some degree. All right, Generosity, Citrine. When this unit uses a healing item, adjacent allies also recover the same amount of HP. So this one's interesting. I would say this is like, I would say it's like high B tier. So it's actually, I don't know, maybe it's like low B tier, because I thought about Citrine's durability. So what's the deal with Citrine? So Citrine is a kind of frail under fire, like most mages, unit who excels in killing things with magic, and especially is one of the better candidates for Dire Thunder ring builds, right? So when she gets hit, especially like mid to late game maddening, she tends to die. So when she's missing health, it can be kind of inconsistent to trigger. So it's going to be hard to trigger, but if you can trigger it and you can set it up, it's good. But it's not going to be as available as Gentle Flower, which just always affects all healing items within a range. So as you need it, you get it. Whereas with Generosity, it's debatable as to how consistently you can use this. The only thing I could think of is if you intentionally reduce her health by running something like Celica to reduce her health as she attacks, and then you can have control over it, but that would be like late game or very early game. And early game, you arguably don't need it. And late game, it could be useful, but there's always Great Sacrifice, which just seems to be better. So it's kind of like an inconsistent short-range Great Sacrifice. And also, if you just pop Micaiah in general, you have AoE healing. So it kind of just gets outclassed by that. But it's not bad. When you can use it and when you can make use of it, it's actually decent. So I'd still say it's low B tier. Share Spoils Lapis. That is a command. I'm telling her to share the spoils. If there's an ally within 1 space, grants hit avoid plus 10 at the cost of crit minus 10. This one's not bad. So if you're not running a crit build, it's just pure upside. So I would say it's like here. It honestly helps, especially if you have like Wyvern squad. And she can be a really good Wyvern early game if you second seal her, and her and Chloe can dominate the early game easily. And this is without DLC or any kind of like XP grinding or anything like that. So it's decent. I usually don't run crit builds, so I don't mind it. Now, if you're running a crit build, it can hurt her ability to crit if you're just not careful with positioning, but it is a good ability. Hit and avoid plus 10 is nice, especially if you're stacking either avoid or you need the extra hit. So it's not a bad ability. I'd say it's pretty good, actually. It's like either like low A or high B. Okay, Train to Kill Yunaka. I would say this is high A tier, potentially S tier. Now, it would be S tier if she had crit daggers at range. Now, you can engrave them with a crit engraving, so that is, like, there's potential there. But if you want to have her consistently crit, you're going to need the melee daggers that crit, right? So there's potential. It's definitely good. It plays into her kit. She's going to be on things that give avoid bonus. So she gets plus 15 crit while on an avoid tile. So that plays into her strengths, right? Like, she wants to be on an avoid tile. And I have seen her consistently crit at like 20 to 30%. You know, just as a bunch of enemies attack her, she'll just throw some crits out. So arguably, maybe it is less, like, maybe it's like here, honestly, the more I think about it. Because if you're enemy phasing like 10 enemies, even at 15% crit rate, some of them are going to eat some crits. And that'll thin their numbers or get them low. So that is pretty strong, to be honest. All right, Will to Win, Zephyr. Okay, if unit's HP is 50% or less at the start of combat, grants hit/avoid plus 20 during combat. So Zephyr is a very late game character. You get her in the late game. Hit avoid plus 20 is nice. And if you want to keep her HP low, that kind of combos with a Wrath build. So arguably with setup, this could be like A tier, but I would say under normal play, it's like high C tier. Because if you're not keeping her low on purpose for a Wrath build, then she's just low HP randomly and it's not consistent. But if you're keeping her low on purpose and you have like Roy on her so that she can't die, so that she has holdout, and you're going for like, you have like Wrath unlocked, which you could easily do, and she's on like a crit axe or a crit bow, that could be pretty good. So depending on the build, I would say it moves up. I would say if you're keeping her low on purpose, she actually could it could be A tier, like low A tier, because then you're just hit avoid plus 20 on a Wrath build, which is pretty nice with holdout. So even if you do get hit, you tank it because of holdout, and then you're taking advantage of the plus 30 crit from Wrath. So pretty interesting, I think. Single-minded Ivy. So this one, all right, so I run a lot of Ivy. During combat with a foe who is unit's most recent opponent, grants hit plus 20. This is situationally useful. So because of that, it can't be an A or S tier. So like good is like, you know, sometimes it's kind of useful. I would say it's like here. Now, here's why. So, all right, so if you're running Ivy long-term, you put an accuracy engraving on her weapons. Like, that's what you do. You put either, like, I think Lucina gives accuracy increase and reduces weight and might by 1, so it helps her double with, like, Bolganon, but it also increases the hit rate. So that's generally what you do, or at least that's what I do. So that way I just completely remove her kind of above. She has, like, 70 to 85% hit rate on a lot of things. And with the Lucina engraving, it's like 100 plus, right? She usually hits everything she attacks. So it completely removes this from the equation. Now, if you want her to be like an enemy phase tank off of a bonded shield, flyer strat, or chi adept strat, this can be useful for when you attack something and then it attacks you, or it can be useful on bosses, or it can be useful when you're dancing and attacking some like high dodge enemy. But they're more accurate units for that. So it's just, it comes in play. Like, it comes into play situationally. It's definitely not the best ability, but it's not the worst ability. It's just kind of okay. All right, Blinding Flash Kagetsu. If unit initiates combat, inflicts avoid minus 10 on foe during combat. So this basically just gives himself 10% more accuracy, which is good. So I would say that's probably like here. So it's like high A tier. So it's not a damage increase, and he starts out on swords, which are very accurate, so you don't really notice the accuracy. But if you put him on lances or axes or something else, it helps. It's hit plus 10. You know, it's always good. It's always going to be useful. And it's on a good unit as well. So, all right, not quite. Zelkov. If foe initiates combat, inflicts hit minus 10 on that foe during combat. So it essentially makes that foe have 10 less hit, or Zelkov have plus 10 more avoid. And for that reason, I would say it's like similar in rating. It's a good ability. If you want to run Zelkov, it's going to make him passively more tanky off evasion tiles, but it also makes him more evasion tanky on evasion tiles. Now, you might hit the threshold where enemies don't attack him. If that's the case, you can just have him player phase and just body block if the choke is 1 tile wide. Alternatively, it could be the thing that makes it so that he can't get attacked enemies won't attack things if they can't hit them. Like if they have 0% hit rate in this game, they won't attack. So that could play against him, but it's a good ability. Even if he's not on Thief, it's still a good ability. It's essentially Avoid +10. So, except not during player phase, only during enemy phase. So it's a very enemy phase ability. All right, big personality, Hortensia. I would say this is like mid S tier. It's staff range +1 for most staves. It affects warp, rewarp, but not rescue. It also affects like heal, physic, and things like this. So you can warp and rewarp 1 extra tile. You can heal, mend, and treat, which is the new well staff, 2 range instead of 1, which is very useful, especially when using her as a staff bot. So if you want to run Hortensia as just a staff user that just uses staves the entire time and then occasionally uses magic, this is like her default use case. She can heal a little bit further, like without physics, so you can conserve physics, then canter to safety, so she can be even further away from the front lines, but also still support the front lines. But this is just a really good ability. It also works on any of her classes. So if she's on like Sage, she can use this and it still does the exact same thing. It's a very good passive. It gives her distinct utility that other staff units lack. All right, Stunning Smile, Rosado. If foe is male, inflicts a void -20 on foe during combat. Okay, so the first thing with this one is that not all foes are male, and not a majority of foes are male. And if there is a majority, it's like 55-45 or like 60-40. There are a lot of female foes, so there are a lot of enemies this doesn't affect. But there are enemies this does affect that are useful. So if there's like a male Wolf Knight or male Swordmasters, those are enemies that can be hard to hit. I would say overall this is like here, like mid B tier. There are better ways to deal with this. So I think the main thing about this is that it was made because he's like an axe lance wyvern. But if you make him a lance sword wyvern or just have him be a lance wyvern, he doesn't have as bad of accuracy. So this is just like a nice bonus when it happens. But overall, it's not like the best thing. And it just kind of helps a little bit with, hit rates randomly. It's kind of hard to play around because you have to check the gender or the sex of the opponent. Disarming Sai, Goldmary. If foe is male, inflicts hit -20 on that foe during combat. So this essentially gives her a void +20 against males during any combat. She's not necessarily an avoid tank, so I don't find this is super useful. I would say it's like mid B tier. It's mid beer, Maybe it's in the wine tier, but I think it's like the beer tier. Yeah, it's just okay. The thing is, I feel like she's like designed for Ike and for tanking, and she definitely isn't the most avoidant of tanks. She tends to be the type of tank who relies on her defense to allow her to tank hits, whereas other tanks might be avoid tanks. So her getting more avoid doesn't really matter that much, and especially if you have Ike popped, your avoid is 0. You just always get hit, so I don't think it's that useful practically. All right, Make a Killing Anna. All right, so I would say this is mid A tier. So originally I would place this much higher, but because of the well and because of just like min-maxing donations. So here's how you min-max donations. Firne level 2 early, Brodia level 4, Brodia level 3 immediately after chapter 7, Brodia level 4 immediately after chapter 8, and then you get a ton of resources on chapter 9 and then the paralogs, and then you do donation level 2 Solm, eventually donation level 2 Illusia, and then you can donation level 4 either Firne, Solm, or Illusia depending on like which paralogs you're doing and whatever. But it's basically like 2-4-2-2 or 2-4-2-4 for the investment. If you do like 3-4-3-4 or 3-4-3-4, like if you hit things at 3, it's not worth it. And the only thing that should really be hitting 4 for sure is like Brodia. So you should have excess money. So this doesn't matter as much as it used to. Early on, when we didn't really understand donation and what was good to donate, this was definitely like S tier because it's free money. Now, if you optimize for this, for making money off of this, it can help you in some ways because it can allow you to hit higher donation tiers in theory. And personally, I've made like 70k running this on a particular run of just using Anna mostly normally, where sometimes I'll feed her extra kills just to like go for triggers, and she had like 40%, like 40 luck, so pretty high trigger rate. It can be really good. It can be S tier depending on how much money you need, but if you're running the well, you generally don't need it. It can help with funding the well, but if you just understand donation and just sell excess items, you don't need it at all. And if you run the heroes weapons, you definitely won't need it. And if you run DLC, you definitely won't need it. But it's still a good ability. It's still extra money. It's just that economy matters less and less with each new update because they hand you more resources and give you more opportunities to make money. All right, Weapon Insight Linden. If unit is equipped with a lower or with a weapon of lower level than foes, grants crit plus 20. This honestly is like, I would say it's like mid-A. Probably better than Anna's. This allows him to pretty consistently use killer weapons on a variety of classes because they're level C, they're rank C, and that's below most endgame enemies. You get him during the endgame. You get him on chapter 19, chapter 18. So he can run killer weapons. He can do the dire Thunder crit build where you run like Erica or Corrin's engraving on a Thunder Tome and then run the dire Thunder Ring, and then he has like tons of crits with Weapon Insight because like Thunder is like D rank or something. So he can just crit like a machine on killer weapons. So it's pretty good actually, and it changes the way you run him. And it essentially turns a kind of average mage into a crit machine that has unique access to on-demand crits that other units wouldn't. And he can also be a physical class, like a warrior or a sniper. And on sniper, that might be low-key his meta, because he gets crit plus 10 just from hitting things that can't counterattack. And then he gets crit plus 20 from his passive of using a killer bow. And then you're looking at crit plus 30 base from killer bow, and then an engraving, and you're looking at like a crit machine. So pretty crazy. Potentially one of the best snipers in the game, unironically, because of his crit access. Racket of Solm, I think, is S tier. For sure. I think it's like here. Honestly, I wouldn't even say it's better than that, but I would say it's like a little bit better than Yunako's. All right, Racket of Solm inflicts crit -5 on foes within 3 spaces. So, all right, some people think Chimera is not that good of a unit. A lot of people understand how to run her and think she's good. Honestly, I think she's like an A tier unit. She's an off tank. So she is a unit that can tank res and defense respecting damage reasonably well. She's not going to tank like 20 things, but she can tank like 3 to 5 things consistently on Ike. She can counterattack with javelins. She can trigger sandstorms on enemy phase. This is actually her intended use case. She was not necessarily meant to be like an offensive sandstorm user. She was mostly for crit mitigation, tanking, holding positions. Like the game hands you her with Ike. It's like a big hint, you know, it's like, this is a tank. But some people misuse her as a damage. She can be built into a damage, but this passive removes crits from enemies. Any enemy that has 5% or like crit or less will have their crits negated. This is very useful on Maddening mode, especially if you're doing something like an Iron Man where you're trying to mitigate risk. Removing crits from foes is very useful. And I've personally seen enemy crit rates go from 5 to 0% on this, across multiple enemies, just from having Chimera out. So it's pretty useful. It also affects enemies attacking her because it's all foes within 3 spaces, and it's a pretty wide range. We need more abilities like this. This is a cool ability. I love the positional things. Like this is a positional thing. This is like a growth thing, but this is positional. This is a positional like circumstance. This is like a item thing. So there's definitely some interesting passives that are cool, but this is really useful, and I found this to help on a lot of my runs. Nothing is more annoying than getting killed by 3% crit. And this just removes those from the equation. All right, Nightly Escort Marin. This is definitely S tier as well. So Marin is a very solid unit on a lot of different classes, and essentially here's what this does. When 2 or more female allies are within 2 spaces, grants a hit/avoid +5 to unit and those allies. So here's how this works. If there are 2 or more females next to her, those 2 females and every other additional female gain hit and avoid +5. So if there's 10 females next to Marin, she's giving them all hit and avoid +5. So if you have Marin and a bondage shield, and you have 3 other females in that bondage shield, or 4 other females, they all are more accurate and have slightly higher avoid rates just from existing. And Marin also gets this. This is one of the best passives in the game, in my opinion. This is definitely S tier. It's on a good unit who can kill things consistently, who can work on any frame, and it affects a huge amount of your allies, similar to Racket of Soul. It's very good. Blood Fury. Panette, if unit's HP is not at max, grants crit plus 10 as long as unit stays below max. I would say this is S tier as well. I wouldn't say it's as good as these. So you can make her a crit machine enemy phase tank that can tank incoming damage and counterattack with crits and kill things. And this boosts her crit rate up. So, and here's the thing, she doesn't have to be low. She can be at like, -1 max health or something. She doesn't have to be very low HP for this to work. You just have to make sure she's not at max. Now, you do have to play around the Dancer because he passively heals everyone by 10%, which we'll get to in a second because that's also his passive. But he, can undo any progress you have on your Wrath units. So you have to be careful with your Dancer positioning. But it's a very strong ability, crit plus 10, pretty easy condition to meet. It's on a unit who can consistently one round, who can consistently crit, and who can consistently enemy phase tank on a crit build specifically, and this helps enable that. All right, Charmer, Fagato, during combat with a foe, who is also unit's most recent opponent, inflicts crit minus 10 on that foe. This is like low C tier. It's gonna come in handy every now and then, but it's too situational, right? Like Fagato, it depends on how you're using him. So if he's on like Warrior or something, he's probably going to be killing things effectively, so enemies aren't going to be living that long. If it's used to mitigate crits from a boss, that boss has to specifically attack him to mitigate those crits. So it's debatable if it's even really useful. Honestly, I don't see it appearing often, especially if you're running him on like Sniper or, Cupido. Some people use Radiant Bow on Cupido on him and find success on that. If he's one-rounding enemies with Radiant Bow, or just putting chip damage on them, and then your other units are cleaning it up, this isn't going to happen often. So when it happens, it might be kind of useful. So it's definitely like low. It's almost bad, but it's not something that's going to happen a lot or that you play around, because it doesn't even really make sense. Like, why would I set something up so that I have reduced incoming crit rate? Like, I just want to kill the enemies. I don't want to like play this weird game where I'm like trying to mitigate crits and hit them specifically. I'd rather just kill them now and not worry about it. Second, Spoonet. Bad. On eating a packed lunch, unit may obtain another of the same item. Trigger percent equals luck. He doesn't have high luck, so it almost never happens. You only get one lunch item. All right, so here, let me break down how this whole situation works. All right, so let me zoom in a little bit. This whole thing was designed around a Celica passive that you can unlock called like Favorite Meal or something, where when you consume leftovers, you can recharge your engage meter to full. Now, that can be situationally useful, maybe. Arguably, there are better ways of playing the game. Maybe for like LTCs, there might be some strategy where that matters. I doubt it, though, because most LTCs clear maps like in under a few turns, so it doesn't make sense. But you can only get leftovers if the meal rank, when you cook, when you can do this once per mission, is I think C or higher, and you get one item of leftovers. You can't have multiple leftovers. So it's contingent on so many things working for this to even work at all that it's just terrible. And even under its best use case, it's not going to happen. Like, you're looking at like a 10% chance, maybe a 20% chance if you're lucky, to fill Bunet's engage meter. Like, honestly, you're better off just smacking an enemy and quadding on a brave weapon, because that's like 4, potentially 5. I think you get an extra one for killing. That's like at least 4, bars of the meter filled. So if you can just brave something that's just way more consistent, and you're also killing something, then because you have to consider you're eating a food to give yourself engage meter, so it's like taking a turn. So if you just get hit on enemy phase a few times, the other thing too is Bunet's a tank, so tanks get attacked a lot, and if he can tank like 5 enemies, that can build a ton of meter just from enemy phase tanking, and that would make him so much better than relying on some weird passive that's terrible. So yeah, it's not that good. All right, Party Animal Pandreo grants a bonus to hit and avoid equal to 3 times the number of allies and foes within 2 spaces. Some people claim it counts him, so this basically gives him a ton of hit and avoid. I would say this is like, it's definitely an S tier. I I would say it's like here. I like these ones because they affect allies, right? So these enable allies like adjacent, within two range, within 3 range, and this just affects him. So for just him, obviously this is great. It makes him, more accurate and increases his avoid. There's use cases where this is really strong. It's definitely an S tier. I don't think these are like necessarily much better than this. I would say these are like, a lot of these are very similar. I don't really think this is like, this is kind of low S tier. This is kind of mid S tier, mid S tier, mid S tier. These are high S tier. I would say these are all at the top. This is a very good ability. Okay, next one is Contemplation for Mavier. If unit uses weight without attacking or using items, grants defense +2 for 1 turn. I'll say it's okay. Like, well, let's be fair. I'll put it next to Meditation. So the reason why this isn't that good is +2 defense is -2 physical damage, and you get him on chapter 21. So you're talking about like way endgame. Like you're about to beat the game. So by the time you get him, it's chapter 21, then chapter 22, and it's a series, so you can't leave it. So by the time you can actually change his loadout, you're in chapter 23, which is very endgame, and enemies in chapter 23 hit like a truck. So chapter 23, 24, 25, 26, all the enemies hit like trucks. So -2 damage is going to do almost nothing. Early game, it does matter. Late game, it does almost nothing. It still does something, so I would still say it's okay. It's not going to make him a tank. It's basically like Dedue's weight, but terrible. And the reason Dedue's weight was good from 3 houses was because you got +4 defense early, and he already had high defense, right? So it just made him that much more tanky. Whereas +2 defense late game, you can kind of see why it would fall off, right? Because enemies have hit like 50 to 60, so it's not going to mitigate enough damage for it to be super useful. All right, Curious Dance Sadal. I would say these are all tied for high S tier, and this is like slightly below them, in my opinion, because these affect allies, right? Like this is better than that. There's no way this is better than that, because what does this do? It just makes a dude an avoid tank. What does this do? It enables all of your team to deal more damage. It enables all your team to hit and avoid. It reduces crit on all your team. It heals all your team. Like these are fantastic abilities, and Curious Dance is no exception. At the start of turn, allies within 2 spaces of unit recover 10% of their max HP. I cannot tell you how many times I have just passively healed units to full health just because they're near Sadal for a few turns. It's crazy. It takes pressure off of your healers. It tops your dudes off, so if you heal someone, doesn't fully heal them, he helps top them off to get them back to full health. It's just constant free healing at all times, like as long as you position him well. And if you throw Canter on him, which is very easy to do, because by the time you get him 2 more chapters later, you can get Canter, you can reposition him to where he's needed most after dancing, and it's just really crazy. It's really good. All right, Fellow Protection, Veil. Adjacent allies deal +1 damage and take 3 less damage. So it's very similar to Alir's ability, except it flips the damage in the mitigation. So it's more mitigation oriented. Now, for mitigation, I don't think it's the best thing if Veil could be potentially in danger, but it's still a good ability. I would say this is like low S tier. So, well, maybe a bit better than Expertise in staff range. Maybe it's like lower mid S tier. It's still good. It's still +1 armor ignoring damage, which isn't as good as 3, so like prioritizing it doesn't matter as much. But you have to consider that when you get Veil, it's very late game. So if you had this the entire time, then you could be mitigating tons of damage early and mid game, and it'd be fantastic. But because you get a late game where the damage values are so high, it's still really strong. Don't get me wrong. It's still useful. If something doubles you, it's still -6 damage. That's still very good. It's good for, reducing damage from your tanks and fixing what the enemies can do to you. So like, for example, if you know an enemy can hit like 6 times 2 on one of your tanks, you can put it to 3 times 2 just by positioning Veil next to that unit. And then if you put Alir next to that unit, you can take off another 2 damage. So it can be useful for damage fixing. It can be useful for mitigation. Veil herself can be quite frail. When she's focused, she tends to die in like 1 or 2 hits. Usually a single round of combat kills her. So you have to be very careful with her positioning when making use of her mitigation. But it's very similar to Flane. Flane reduced damage, I think, by 3. and was frail, so it's kind of similar to Flame in that way, where as long as you can enemy phase and you check the distance the enemies can attack and the ranges, and you play the enemy phase game well, you can mitigate damage, and it's pretty good. But arguably, like at the stage you get it, I don't think the damage mitigation matters that much, especially because a lot of the endgame maps favor hyper aggression. So for example, Chapter 23 hits you with infinite reinforcements, and you can slow push it and beat it, but you generally want to kind of warp at some point. You want to fight, you want to clear out most of the enemies and then warp skip it, I would say. If you like, that's like normally playing it, in my opinion. You can slow push one of the flanks, but you just keep getting frozen by annoying things and have to deal with all these dumb enemies, and you're better off at some point being super aggressive and warp skipping it at least halfway through. Chapter 24, there's a literal turn limit. So you have so many turns before either A, you get overrun by reinforcements, or B, you run out of turns and lose. So you kind of have to be super aggressive on Chapter 24. On Chapter 25, everyone knows that map, you can't be chill. You can't just sit there and do nothing. There's tons of reinforcements. This is probably the most warp skipped map in the game. And then on Chapter 26, it's a similar story where the faster you can beat it, the better, because if you take your time, the reinforcements will overpower you. So you have to just kill the emblem rings, nuke the dragon down, and then just beat the game. So if you got this mid game, this is where it would shine, and I'd say it was S tier. So because you get to use all of these throughout most of the game, they remain relevant. Whereas with this, because it's on maps that favor aggression, you're still going to be enemy phase tanking to some degree, like in some parts of the maps, but arguably you should be moving like a bonded shield forward every turn, killing as many enemies as possible, and then warping that into the bosses and killing them for Chapter 23. So it's a good ability. It's on a unit who's frail, and the time you get it is inconvenient. If you get it earlier, it'd be high S, but I'd still say it's still -3 damage to whoever's standing next to it. It's still really strong. Like, don't get me wrong, it's still a good ability, but it's not as strong as like this. So here's my list. Let me know if you agree or disagree with any of these. If I rated something too low or too high in your opinion, if you make a good argument as to why I'm wrong, you can change my mind. So there's that. Definitely like and subscribe if you enjoy this type of content, and I'll see you in the next one.